He was only 7 years old, hooked up to his own 4, fighting his own battle against leukemia, when he asked his nurse if he could pray for the little girl in the room next door. Nobody expected what happened next. By the end of that week, doctors, nurses, and strangers across the entire hospital wing were talking about a prayer they couldn't stop thinking about. His name was Eli Cordero, 7 years old, a patient at a children's hospital in San Antonio, Texas, in the middle of his second round of chemotherapy for acute lymphoblastic leukemia. Eli had been diagnosed almost 8 months earlier, and in that time, he had spent more days inside those hospital walls than at home, more hours hooked to machines and 4 lines than playing outside the way most 7-year-olds spend their days. His parents, Marisol and Danny Cordero, had watched their son endure more in 8 months than most adults endure in a lifetime, the exhausting cycles of treatment, the nausea, the hair loss, the long, difficult stretches of isolation from friends and normal childhood. And yet, through nearly all of it, Eli had maintained a steady, gentle spirit that amazed the hospital staff who cared for him, a quiet resilience that seemed, to everyone around him, far beyond his 7 years. Marisol and Danny had raised Eli in a home of consistent, simple faith, teaching him to pray each night before bed, bringing him to church every Sunday before his diagnosis had made regular attendance impossible. Eli had taken to that faith in his own childlike, sincere way, praying not just for himself during his treatment, but frequently for other people around him, a habit that had touched the hearts of several nurses on his regular rotation who had grown genuinely fond of the quiet, thoughtful boy in room 412. It was during Eli's second round of chemotherapy that he first noticed the little girl in the room next door. Her name was Sophie Chen, 6 years old, admitted just days earlier following a serious car accident that had left her with critical internal injuries. Sophie's situation was dire enough that her parents had barely left her bedside since her admission, the entire family holding on to increasingly fragile hope as doctors worked to stabilize a condition that remained, according to the medical team, extremely uncertain. Eli had overheard hushed conversations between nurses discussing Sophie's condition, picking up fragments of information the way children often do, understanding enough to know that the little girl next door was fighting for her life in a way that felt urgent and frightening even to Eli's own young understanding. That evening, during his usual bedtime routine, Eli asked his favorite nurse, a woman named Cassandra Lopez who had cared for him through most of his treatment, a question that caught her completely off guard. "Miss Cassandra, can I pray for the little girl next door? I heard she's real sick, and I don't want her to be scared like I was when I first got here." Cassandra, moved nearly to tears by the question, gently explained hospital privacy policies, that she couldn't share specific details about another patient, but that she thought praying for Sophie was a beautiful thing for Eli to want to do. "Can I go see her?" Eli asked. "I just want to pray for her the way people pray for me sometimes. I think it might help her not be so scared." Cassandra, uncertain at first, consulted with the charge nurse and, after confirming with Sophie's parents that they would welcome the gesture, arranged for Eli, still connected to a portable 4-pole, to be gently wheeled into Sophie's room for a brief visit. Sophie's parents, David and Jenny Chen, were sitting exhausted at their daughter's bedside when Eli was wheeled in, 4-pole rattling softly beside him, his small bald head a visible testament to his own ongoing battle. Sophie herself was barely conscious, sedated and connected to a concerning number of machines and monitors, her small body swallowed by the hospital bed around her. Eli approached slowly, careful and quiet, and looked at Sophie's parents with a gentle, earnest sincerity that immediately disarmed whatever hesitation they might have carried about a strange child visiting their daughter's room. "Hi, I'm Eli," he said simply. "I'm sick too, but I'm getting better. I wanted to pray for your little girl, if that's okay. I know what it's like to be scared in here, and I don't want her to feel alone." Jenny Chen, exhausted and emotionally raw from days of uncertainty, broke down crying at the simple sincerity of the offer, nodding through tears, unable to speak for a moment. David, equally moved, gently thanked Eli and welcomed him closer to Sophie's bedside. Eli, with the careful, unself-conscious sincerity only a child could manage, reached out and gently placed his small hand near Sophie's, careful of the wires and tubes connected to her small body, closed his eyes, and prayed out loud, his young voice steady and clear in the quiet hospital room. "Dear Jesus, please help Sophie feel better. I know she's real scared and real sick, just like I was. Please help the doctors know exactly what to do to help her. Please let her wake up and see her mommy and daddy soon. And please help her not be scared, because I know you're right here with her, even when it doesn't feel like it. Amen." Cassandra, standing quietly near the doorway, wiped tears from her own eyes, and by the time Eli finished his simple, unpolished prayer, there wasn't a dry eye remaining among the small group gathered in that room. Word of Eli's visit spread quickly through the hospital staff over the following days, first among the nurses on that particular floor, then further through the hospital, an unusual, deeply moving story about a 7-year-old cancer patient who had asked to pray for the critically injured little girl next door. Several staff members, moved by the story, began quietly checking in on both children more frequently than their standard rounds required, drawn by an experience that had touched something deeper in many of them than they were accustomed to encountering during typical hospital routines. Sophie's condition, precarious for the first several days following her admission, began showing signs of gradual improvement starting the same week as Eli's visit, her vital signs slowly stabilizing in ways that, while medically explainable through the ongoing treatment she was receiving, felt to her parents like something more significant given the timing. Dr. Patricia Wembley, the pediatric surgeon overseeing Sophie's care, was careful, as most doctors are, to attribute Sophie's improvement primarily to the medical interventions being administered. But even she, in a conversation with Sophie's parents days later, acknowledged that the timing and trajectory of Sophie's recovery had exceeded what she typically expected given the severity of her initial injuries. "I can't tell you medically why she's responding this well this quickly," Dr. Wembley admitted. "I'm grateful for it, and I'm not going to pretend I have a full explanation for every factor at play here." Jenny Chen, sitting beside her daughter's steadily improving bedside that week, found herself thinking often about Eli's simple, sincere prayer, the earnest sincerity of a 6-7-year-old boy who had wheeled himself into her daughter's room simply because he didn't want another child to feel alone and afraid the way he once had. Sophie woke up fully 5 days after Eli's visit, disoriented but alert, her condition continuing to improve steadily in the days that followed. Once she was well enough for visitors beyond her immediate family, Jenny made a point of bringing Sophie, still weak but recovering, to visit Eli in his own room, wanting her daughter to meet the boy who had prayed for her during the most frightening days of her young life. The two children, both bald from their respective treatments, both wearing hospital gowns, both far too young to fully understand the gravity of what either of them had been through, became fast friends over the following weeks, their families forming a bond that neither had expected walking into that hospital. Eli's own treatment continued over the following months, and while his road remained difficult, his family found unexpected encouragement in the story that had unfolded from his simple act of childlike compassion. Marisol Cordero, watching her son's own battle unfold alongside the story of Sophie's recovery, found her own faith deepened in ways she hadn't expected during such an exhausting, frightening season for her family. "I used to pray mostly just for Eli during those months," Marisol admitted later. "Watching my own sick son ask to pray for another sick child, at 7 years old, taught me something about faith I don't think I ever would have learned any other way." He wasn't focused on his own fear in that moment. He was focused on making sure another scared child knew she wasn't alone. The story of Eli's hospital prayer eventually reached beyond the walls of that particular floor, shared first informally among hospital staff, then more widely after a local news outlet, hearing about the story through one of the nurses involved, ran a brief, heartfelt feature on the two families and the unlikely friendship that had formed between their children. The hospital chaplain, a soft-spoken man named Chaplain Rodriguez who had worked in pediatric hospice and critical care for over 15 years, later reflected on the story during a hospital staff devotional, describing it as one of the most powerful examples of childlike faith he had witnessed in his entire career. "We spend so much energy as adults overcomplicating what faith is supposed to look like," Chaplain Rodriguez told the gathered staff. A 7-year-old boy, in the middle of his own frightening battle, simply saw another child who was scared, and did the one thing he knew how to do. He prayed for her, out loud, without hesitation, without worrying about whether it would sound right or whether anyone would think it was strange. I believe, with everything in me, that prayer mattered. I believe it moved something in that room, in that hospital, and in every single person who has heard the story since. Eli completed his treatment successfully roughly a year later, entering remission after a long, difficult road that tested his family in every possible way. Sophie made a full recovery from her injuries as well, and the two families have remained close in the years since, their children growing up with a friendship forged in one of the most difficult seasons either family has ever faced. Eli, now several years older, still remembers that hospital visit clearly, though he describes it now with the simple, unpretentious honesty of a child who never fully understood, at the time, how significant that moment would become to everyone who witnessed it. I just didn't want her to be scared, he says, still today, when asked about it. I knew what that felt like. I figured praying might help her feel a little less alone, the same way it helped me. If you are walking through your own hospital room tonight, whether literally or in some other painful, frightening season of your life, please hear this story and let it remind you of something beautifully simple. You do not need perfect theology, polished words, or complete understanding to pray a prayer that matters. Sometimes the simplest, most sincere prayers, offered by the most unlikely people in the most unlikely circumstances, carry more power than we could ever fully explain. A 7-year-old boy, fighting for his own life, chose in that moment to think of someone else's fear instead of his own. And in doing so, he reminded an entire hospital wing what faith, in its purest and most childlike form, actually looks like. Whoever you are praying for tonight, however small or unpolished that prayer feels, don't underestimate what it might set in motion. Sometimes the smallest prayers move the biggest mountains.